Oh, the Indian Act.
The Indian Act is a Canadian legislation that governs registered First Nations citizens and was established in 1876. It only affects First Nations people, not Métis or Inuit. The Act defines who is or is not Indian and dictates the way that reserves and their bands operate. It was made in an attempt to organize rights promised to First Nations peoples by George III in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, while at the same time enforcing European standards of civilization.
But there's no secret. There's no secret here. The Indian Act was designed to assimilate, to make us just like everybody else.
Aboriginal women. And one of their reactions to Aboriginal women was that we were really not that important. We were invisible. I grew up poor. My father was Irish. I didn't become a real Indian in Canada under the law until September 19th, 1980 at 3:20 p.m. And the reason I can make that precision determination is because I got married to a man from Chapel Island. My mother wasn't happy, but let's not talk about that. So when we look at the Indian Act and colonialism, the Indian Act determines, even today, who is an Indian under the Indian Act, who has status, who has rights to treaty, who has rights to benefits. Because the Indian Act, during the time of the Victorian age, when women had no power at all, the Indian Act focused on Aboriginal women. If you married off the reserve, you were no longer an Indian. If you were married to someone else from another community, you became a member of that community. And that really undercut our communities because the women had power through politics, through raising our children, passing on culture and language.
Amendments to Bill C-31 provided a process where women could apply for reinstatement of their lost Indian status. While it looked to be a good thing, it proved to be extremely difficult for women to go through the process. The cost was huge as applicants were forced to pay with traveling from sometimes very remote communities to other centers, plus the cost for research and documentation fees.
Along with determining who has status, the Indian Act targeted the First Nations culture. It forbade ceremonies, dances, and languages. Europeans found Indian names confusing and difficult to pronounce. In 1890, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs ordered Indian names to be changed with an English Christian name and retain the surname.
He says, if all you understand is the word Indian, then I'll be an Indian to you. And what he's saying is because Japanese can be called Japanese, Chinese can be called Chinese, Mexicans, Germans, and so forth, then why can't I be called Anishinaabe? Anishinaabe and Dao. That's all he's saying. Why can't that be so? Why do I have to be called Indian? Why do I have to be called Aboriginal? And so on. Why do we have to be all lumped together into one? When we're so different, our languages are different and so forth.
Since retiring from politics in 2006, former Prime Minister Paul Martin has dedicated much of his time to raising awareness about the educational challenges faced by young Aboriginal Canadians. So it should come as no surprise that he's not very happy about the Harper government's decision to withdraw Bill C-33, also known as the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act, along with the funding that goes with it.
Of providing fair funding. In other words, right now, if you go to a reserve school, you receive anywhere from 20 to, in some cases, 50% per capita less funding than the provinces are providing for a school that might be, 2 kilometers away. Everybody understood that gap existed. And then the first time that the AFN got ready to meet with the Prime Minister, the day before, the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time made a public announcement that there was no such gap, which meant that the whole purpose of the meeting had been thrown into the wastebasket.
Along with inadequate funding for education for First Nation students, the Indian Act had made it mandatory to attend residential schools in 1920.
over 150,000 Aboriginal children were forcibly taken from their families in order to assimilate them into white European society.
Be a roadblock to like good relationships between natives and then non-native people.
Yes. Yes, it is a roadblock because when you go and you hear chiefs speak on behalf of their people in large forums, you'll hear the same thing. We want to work with the Canadian government, with governments on a nation-to-nation level, because we see ourselves as a Anishinaabe nation. We see as our own. We have our own nation. But how do we do that when you don't look at us like that? We're under you, you know, and we're saying that we're not. So as a result, this Indian Act is in the way, you know, of that progress.